Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Virtual Iowa Quiltscape. My name is Megan Barrett. I'm the director here at the Iowa Quilt Museum, and we are located in Winterset, Iowa, just southwest of Des Moines a little bit. We have been open since 2016 on the town square in Winterset, and we are nestled in between two fabulous quilt shops. And in addition to a great quilting adventure in Winterset, you can also visit the covered bridges of Madison County that were made popular by the book, movie, and musical. You can visit a museum dedicated to John Wayne. This is the birthplace of John Wayne. And there are wonderful shops and dining and lots of great things to visit. So as you're thinking about travel happening again, I would encourage you to put Winterset on your list for a little trip to come see us. We are joined today by Pam Weeks, and Pam is she is the curator of the New England Quilt Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts. Where are you actually right now, this moment,
I
Pam?
live in a little tiny town called Auburn, New Hampshire, which is about a 42.5 minute drive from Lowell.
All right. I didn't think you were actually in Lowell.
No.
So good. Thanks for joining us today. And the reason that Pam is online with us is she served as guest curator for us here at the Iowa Quilt Museum for the exhibit we have installed right now, which is titled A Quilted Garden. And these are all floral quilts from the collection of the New England Quilt Museum. You may know that the Iowa Quilt Museum has no collection of our own. We are what's termed an exhibit-only museum. And so everything that we display in 4 different exhibits each year is on loan to us. Sometimes it's from the artists themselves or from private collectors. And every once in a while, we work with another museum, just like we have for this exhibit. Although not often have we borrowed an entire exhibit from another museum. But we talked to Pam about curating for us at some point in time. And we wanted to do a floral quilt exhibit, and she thought that that sounded like a lovely project, and so we brought her on board for that. So Pam, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us just a little bit about yourself, about the New England Quilt Museum, and about how you arrived at the particular quilts in this exhibit.
Thank you so much for inviting us to come play in Iowa. Um, about myself, I started quilting at the time of the bicentennial, which some people call the second or the third great quilt revival. Um, I became a quilt artist right away, designing my own stuff. But in the mid 1990s, I fell in love with antique quilts, and to my great surprise, became a quilt historian and got the job of my life about 10 years ago at the New England Quilt Museum. The New England Quilt Museum was founded in I believe, 1987 is our official date. So we're coming up on our 35th, yeah, 35th anniversary. I can do math on some days. Um, we've been in our present building since 1993. We have more than 700 objects in our collection. And when I was considering the floral garden or the quilted garden idea, it struck me that there would be a lot of red and green applique quilts, but that we should also address textiles printed with florals and quilting patterns that might have florals, as well as some piece patterns that might be floral. And we have a lot of quilts that can't travel. So these you consider our best traveling quilts, although we have some other pretty spectacular quilts in our collection. And the second thing I wanted to do for Iowa, well, actually 2 more things, is to have a broad range in dates of quilts. The earliest one that I sent circa 1825. And then I also wanted to send a few quilts that you might not see in the Midwest, such as a large wool whole cloth, or what we call a tea quilt that we looked at last time. Tea quilts have their bottom corners cut out to fit around a 4-poster bed. So I think I hit all the bits you wanted me to, Megan. Anything else I should add?
Nope, that sounds great. So, sorry, sometimes I can't click and talk at the same time.
Just don't chew gum too.
So, if you did not join us on part 1 of this gallery walk, You're definitely going to want to go back and see that. 2 weeks ago, Pam was here with us, and we walked through the oldest quilts in the collection, including the two whole cloth quilts, many of the red and green quilts from the early 20th century. And so you can catch that on our YouTube page if you haven't seen that yet. So today we're going to kind of start at that point and move a little bit more forward. And you can see behind me, I've got a couple that we're going to focus on today. One is an album quilt, and the other is a unique kind of application stenciling. So I'm going to do a screen share, and we'll just talk about the first quilt that pops up, which is the New England album quilt.
No, it's not. It's called,
Oh, it's Blessed Be the Tie That Binds.
thank you. Blessed be the tie that binds. I was clever enough to remember to bring all the label content home with me, but they're not very well organized. So there'll be a lot of shifting through. It's actually called Circle of Friends. So in the 90s, we did talk briefly about different fads in quilting. And one of the fads happened in the 1840s, mid-Atlantic. They're called Baltimore album quilts. And in the 1980s and 1990s, a wonderful woman named Ellie Sienkiewicz revived that, that fad, as well as some other quilters at the time who really loved applique. And Ellie Sienkiewicz traveled to New England, where she formed many organizations called, well, the Good Ladies of Baltimore were some of the applique artists, but in New England, she formed many chapters of the Good Ladies of Baltimore North. Marjorie Lydecker was already teaching on Cape Cod, south of Boston, and formed the Cape Cod chapter of the Good Ladies of Baltimore. And she took lessons with Ellie and then continued teaching. So the backstory of this is that Marjorie Lydecker joined the frenzy, and Ellie mentioned that there was a very special botanical quilt that she would like replicated. The next day, Marjorie and her group volunteered to lead this special assignment and eventually got permission to copy a botanical quilt in the collection of the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Museum at Williamsburg. Marjorie and friends traveled to Virginia, where they were granted 3 whole hours to copy the quilt using a transparency provided by the curatorial staff. They made detailed notes, transcribed the inscriptions. The reproduction of this quilt, which you see in front of you, took 3 years to complete. And Marjorie, who is still living and actively quilting in her 90s, considers it her favorite quilt, and we are blessed to have it in our collection. It did appear in one of Ellie Sienkiewicz's books, and it's a nice example of kind of a restrained Baltimore album with many, many flowers. I particularly love the geranium in that lower right-hand view that you can see of the quilt.
So now I've never tried to replicate a quilt, but 3 hours seems to me like not very much time at all.
So I'm guessing they also took really good photographs, but what they would have done with this transparency, they would have placed the transparency over a block and traced it. And I'm not exactly sure what type of medium they would have been allowed near the quilt, certainly not a magic marker. But they would have been able to trace the block and the transparency. And then Marjorie is just an amazing craftsperson, so she would have had the skill to recreate the patterns.
Yes, obviously a lot of skill involved with this.
So this is admittedly not a very pretty thing, but it's a great example of Ruby McKim patterns for the state flowers. And there were many embroidery and patchwork patterns that were available through the newspapers. And give me a second and I'll find this state flower quilt. Ruby McKim was a very prolific designer in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And any of the other quilt historians who are on this page, here we go, are on today can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Dorothy Elsifer Van Horn from Omaha, Nebraska made this quilt. And she did embroider some of the blocks as a little girl. Then she set it aside and finished it many years later. And the gift of the quilt to the museum included the notebook of the newspaper clippings and the patterns. Now, Rosie Werner is the expert in our midst, who's an expert in quilt kits, and said the patterns for the state flowers were in the Omaha World Herald in 1931. Ruby McKim utilized fancy stitches like French knots, blanket stitch, and lazy daisy to make the flowers look realistic. And each quilt, each block has the state initials embroidered in the corner of the block. So these are all the state flowers.
So now, am I correct in my assumption that a block or maybe two would be printed in each week's paper? And so this was kind of a marketing tool for newspapers to get you
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's not the only example of quilting being really closely tied to marketing. Lindsay McRae could tell us a lot about feed sacks and how women using feed sacks for clothing and quilting really drove that development of that as a marketing tool.
And when we get to the, if we get to the Bluebell quilt, that's another example of patterns that were printed in newspapers for people to send in real money and get the pattern sent to them.
Real money, yes. Ah,
there it is.
That's a segue.
That is on the first page, I noticed. So Catherine Willard Richter made this in New York. The pattern Bluebells was published in newspapers on August 9th, 1937 by the designer Alice Brooks and was available for 15 cents in real money. So Alice Brooks and Laura Wheeler were names of fictional characters that a company used to sell their patterns. And you were to send your real money either to your local newspaper or to the Needlecraft Service in New York City. Mary Kay Volvogel and another quilt historian whose name just left my head recently presented in the American Quilt Study Group workshop series entire session on Alice Wheeler. I do it all the time, Alice Brooks and Laura Wheeler. So when we received this quilt, the donor actually called it a water lily. And Laura Lane is our collections manager at the museum. She and I were on separate tracks without knowing about it, trying to find out what the real pattern name was. And within 6 or 7 hours of each other, found the Bluebell pattern. And we've renamed the quilt Bluebell. And this picture's a bit off. The background of the quilt is kind of peachy. And that's a deep navy blue in the leaves. But that's the way this thing, when we photographed it, that's just the way it came out, was quite white.
Yeah. Well, it looks peachy on my screen, but it transmits through video, you know, who knows what happens, right?
I probably spilled chlorine on mine.
So this may be a good time to note that if you're a person who would really like to see, spend a little bit more time up close and personal with each quilt, we have created and just put it online in the last couple of days, our virtual gallery tour, or, you know, virtual admissions, so to speak. And so each quilt is photographed and you get a high resolution photo zooming in and panning through the quilts. And then I narrate the description that is hanging near the quilt. It's about 45 minutes in length this time, but it gives you all of the information and an up close look at each quilt. And then of course you can pause and go back and rewind and see it again. So shall we go to this one next or save it? Because this is quite a deviation from where we're at.
Oh no, I think we'll just do it. It's a Hawaiian quilt. And the little bit of research that I've done for the two Hawaiian quilts in our collection all came from the Binney family. Basically, the story goes that wives of New England missionaries introduced their quilting tradition to native Hawaiians in the early 19th century. Over the next 200 years, two quilting styles became prominent in the islands. And this is one of them. The first is a two-color cutwork applique based on naturalistic motifs. And quilts, the second kind, are quilts with historical themes that include the Hawaiian flag and royal crests. Now, the research has been updated, but a couple of quilt historians still say that the legend has it that the designs for these Hawaiian cutwork quilts were initiated after a woman saw a shadow of a tree cast upon a piece of cloth drying in the sun and thought it so beautiful that she traced the branches onto fabric and made it into a quilt. And many of these cutwork applique quilts are based on flowers or fruits found in the Hawaiian Islands and thus named. But as I stated before we started, I have tried in all of my reference books to find a name for this pattern, and I couldn't find one. So if anybody knows the name of this pattern, oh, looking at it, it might be fun to call it star flower, but I think we need to find a real Hawaiian flower that we could call it.
Now, somebody has asked me about this one, um, and why the fabric is a different color on the outs, the border.
Mhm.
My guess is, and tell me if I'm just way off base here. Shoot, zoomed out too far. That when these two fabrics were first put together, they looked much closer than they do now, but they're different dye lots and
Yeah.
they're aged differently.
Yes, that would be the wise and intelligent and kind answer. And the snarky answer is, I don't know, I wasn't there.
I like that too.
We have too much fun, Megan. Now, this one is very interesting. So you heard me talk about Alice Brooks and Laura Wheeler. And one of the things that the company produced were lots and lots and lots of butterfly patterns. And this may be one of them. Generally, you see these quilts just with the butterflies and sashing. Generally, as this one, it was popular in this period to line your applique with um, black embroidery floss. I'm trying to get to my description here, but what I love is the way this artist chose to put a bouquet of pansies in the middle of her quilt. Not coming across it. I know I have it. Just give me a second here. So the other thing that's marvelous to me about it is that the, is that it there? Yes. No, it's not. What's marvelous, I'm not finding the label. What's marvelous about it is that all the butterflies are leaving the center. It's like they had their sniff of the flowers, and she's arranged each block so the butterfly is flying away from the center of the block. And I don't think those are pansies now that I'm looking closer. I think they're nasturtiums, but it's just a wonderful example of an artistic bent on a common pattern of the time. And the other thing that I'm seeing that's quite remarkable, your photography is glorious, is look at how carefully she placed the motifs of the quilted flower around the center and then echoed it on each place where the sashing crosses.
Yeah, we were able to get a good relief on this one. It's sometimes hard to capture the quilting, but it really just depends on how the fabric and the lighting and
Oh,
all of
here
that.
it is. I found it. It was made by Susie Alice Farnworth Smith of Melrose, Massachusetts. She also did still life paintings, painted on china, and made quilts. She actually cut the flowers in the center from printed fabric, which is called broderie perse or chintz cutwork applique. And again, the notes note the way the butterflies are leaving the center of the quilt.
Yeah, we see, just like Sunbonnet Sue or whatever, it's these repetitive blocks are fairly common. And I don't always care for them for that reason, but this one really is just kind of charming.
It moves.
Here's one.
Frances Abel Brand was one of Marge Lydecker's friends on Cape Cod, and she was a master at early American decorative painting and stenciling. And a few years ago, the Vermont Quilt Festival featured her stenciled quilts beside her early American decorative painting. So this is stenciled. Who was it, Carmen, who was talking about doing wall stenciling? To my knowledge, nobody, and there are many early 19th century American quilts that were stenciled, but to my knowledge, no one has done any work on the relationship or the possible relationship between wall stenciling from the 18th century and early 19th century and the stenciled textiles. But Frances was just a master at composition. She cut her own stencils. These are her original designs. And the quilting is just expert. She made lots and lots of quilts. In fact, when she passed, her children kept many of the quilts. And I don't mean this to be a commercial for them, but if you Google Frances Abel Brand, you will come up to the family's website. And a few of her pieces are being offered for sale.
Yeah, I love the dense quilting in the white parts really just makes those motifs, the bird and it just really pops out. It's just
Yes, they do. That person also mentioned, I think it was Carmen, that she did some stenciling in the 1970s and early 1980s, as did I. I made about 6 or 7 small stenciled quilts. And at the time, we were taught to use oil paints, some of the early American Frances Abel Brand, B-R-A-N-D. We were able to do some really beautiful shaded work with the large brushes that we were taught to use. I think we hit it. The pansy quilt. So we were offered a few quilts from Gail Berg-Sprout and her sister Marvel Burge. So this is made by Mildred Zimmerman, who lived from the late 1890s to 1957 in California. And the mother of the donors of these quilts and another quilt purchased the entire Zimmerman estate at the time that Mildred died. And according to one of the sisters, their mother sold the furniture and collectibles in garage sales before they were popular. But it seems the family kept the quilts. This is a commercial pattern. And it's executed so beautifully that I think it really transcends the commercial pattern. She's got gorgeous pansy sprays that seem to be just twirling in circles, and her use of color in the borders is just perfect. What we probably can't see, Megan, is that there are lots of embroidered details on this one. If you scan in, you might be able to catch the center of some of the pansies that are embroidered, as well as the quilting, which is expertly done as well. I believe some of the quilts the family also donated to the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. When I was a little girl, my nickname was Pansy, so I love these quilts. Megan, should we be looking at the chat? We're up to 7 questions. Nope, we've got it.
yeah, I think we've pretty much hit everything.
All right. This is what we call the sunflower quilt, or that's the title that came with it. Again, another commercial pattern, but this one is also beautifully embellished. The sunflowers, I just love the way she reverses the pattern in each of the rows. So again, they feel to me like they're dancing, and then the border has those wonderful sprays of the sunflower buds. And again, this is beautifully, can you scroll in? Laura Lane is on here. Laura, remind me, are the centers of those flowers French knots, if I remember right? Or am I just?
I believe they are.
There's Laura. Yeah, Laura's our collection managers, folks. And then there's some embroidery details on some of the flowers around the outside edge, if I remember. Laura, go ahead and add anything about these 2 quilts that I might have forgotten.
Yeah, again, this is another of the Millie Zimmerman ones. And we have not yet traced down the pattern of this one. We're still looking.
But we did find a copy of the pansy pattern, right?
No.
Oh, the
Oh yeah,
pansy.
yeah, the pansy, but not the sunflower.
Are you corrupting your files, Megan?
Picked my charger with I caught it with my foot,
Oh.
unplugged my adapter with my SD card, which was using the photos. So give me a second, I'll get all those things hooked back up.
Ah, technology.
It's so grand.
Actually, I saw in the chat while you're catching up, Laura mentioned that in the the quilt to your left, there are actually 7 of those patterns, Laura, that appear in Ellie Sienkiewicz's books. I think that's what Laura said in the chat. Where's the chat? 4 of the 4 or 5 of the block patterns in the applique quilt that Ellie Sienkiewicz charged Fran Lydecker to do. All
And
right, that's
they're
a sense.
not all in the same book either.
Got it. All right, this is called the Lotus Eater. And Sandy Donabed was a Massachusetts art quilter who moved herself to Florida. I don't understand why not everybody like me loves New England winters. But the Lotus Eaters is very typical of what Sandy does. She collects vintage textiles. She cuts up the bits that she wants to keep. I believe this is appliqued onto a tablecloth background, and she's got a beautiful collection of applique as well as embroidered motifs. And it's called the Lotus Eaters because there's a lotus in the center of the quilt with birds and exotic flowers all around it. And are those snakes? They look like snakes. Knowing her, they probably are snakes. But she just uses vintage textiles that would otherwise be discarded in such a wonderful, creative way. And I thought it would be fun to throw in some art quilts. So here you are.
Botanicals are a theme. I think you wrote this in your curator statement that since the moment when humankind was beginning to decorate their bodies or their handmade items, botanicals have been a motif or a theme. And obviously that's never gone away, and unlikely to do so because there's such an inspiration. I mean, it's just the most pure natural art.
It's what's around us, and it's what we see every day. And whether we are walking in the woods or peering out our windows these days, if you're lucky enough and not to live in a city where you would see less, you just see it all around us. So when I was taking my my appraisal courses through the American Quilter Society, there were 2 very talented teachers who started teaching us about how textiles were printed. And Bobby Ogg said, just think about the first way to print textiles, which would be to take mud or blood and make a blob with your finger, and you've got polka dots all over your deer skin. Or if you take your finger and use the mud or the blood, and you can just very easily print flower petals in a circle around a center blob. So the floral motifs would have been some of the easiest and the most commonsensical to start with in decorating anything. Faye Labanaris is a Dover, New Hampshire native who really glommed onto Ellie Sienkiewicz's applique work and took it beyond. This is a piece that was made for Lars Kane, and I'm going to take a second and find the label so that I get it right. Faye, after studying with Ellie Sienkiewicz, wrote her own books about 3-dimensional applique using a lot of wired ribbon. She gave this quilt to Lars Kane to thank him for presenting quilt seminars at the Kachiko Quilt Guild Biennial in New Hampshire. An inked inscription in the lower right-hand corner is a quote from Celia Thaxter that describes the window of Adele Hepworth of Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1888. So Celia Thaxter, for those who don't know, some of our New England poets spent her life on the coast of New Hampshire between Portsmouth, New Hampshire and the Isles of Shoals, which is a group of 6 or 8 small islands about 8 miles off Rye, New Hampshire. She gained additional fame for her lush gardens at her home on Appledore Island. And she also had a salon to which many famous painters came, and Childe Hassam was one of them, as well as Edwin Tarbell and other Boston-centered, New England-centered impressionist artists of the period. She uses lace, she uses ribbon, she uses printed fabrics to approximate the window. And Celia Thaxter's most popular book of poems is An Island Garden, and it was published in 1894. And this was donated by Lars Kane in memory of his mother.
And this one is quite small. It's only 18 by 24-ish.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Yeah, which is why I can get so much detail because I photograph it close up.
Now, albertine vinstra. I think I know where that label is quickly. It is a, is it 1980s? Come on, I know where that one lives.
1994.
Thank you.
Only because it's over my shoulder.
Here it is, Albertine Vinstra. She began sewing when she was 4 years old. She was taught by her grandmother and then by professional seamstresses in her home of Altruyère, Luxembourg. She enrolled in the Association of Professions in Luxembourg, where she trained for 5 years with the goal of becoming a couturière. She completed her degree after a 4-year apprenticeship. She emigrated to the United States in 1961 and became interested in quilt making during the bicentennial, like so many of us did. She has won many awards for her artistic expression and skill of her workmanship. And this is another quilt that uses both original and traditional Baltimore album style designs. And again, Albertine's Rose Climber block is featured in Baltimore album quilts by Ellie Sienkiewicz. And I think that, I'm not sure, Laura, do you know, is that the center block that is in Ellie's book? No, it's the top one. It's the top center one, I think, that's in Ellie Sienkiewicz's book. Is that right, Laura?
Center.
Yeah, top center. That's in one of Ellie's books as well. So Ellie Sienkiewicz came up from Baltimore and infected New England with the applique bug. And we're happier for it. Now this baby, I burned hours trying to find out more about this quilt. It was made by a young man, and there is an inscription on the lower right-hand corner. His name was John W. Yerger of Saratoga, Pennsylvania. It's hand appliqued, pieced, and quilted. Unfortunately, it was purchased from a dealer by Robert and Mary Lou Sutter, who donated it to the museum in 1995. At the time the quilt was donated, the donors went through quite a bit to try to find out more about Mr. Yerger. And they actually went through a telephone directory in Saratoga, and they made calls until they found his widow, who knew nothing, of course, about his quilt making. She was able to tell them that her late husband was a pattern maker for an iron foundry in Saratoga, which is near Pottstown. And a foundry pattern maker makes the patterns for casting of fancy metals and must be able to read blueprints and follow exact specifications when creating a pattern. At the time he made the quilt, he was in his mid-20s and not yet married. And I spent hours on Ancestry.com, on newspapers.com, trying to find out more about this family. and found no more than the Sutters found when they tried to do some research in 1995. I have a suspicion that it's a commercial pattern, but again, we have not found a source for it. And it's just full of the wonderful calicos that were available at the time the quilt was made. Many of the Eli Walker, the small, bright prints, but it says commercial pattern to me, but we've not found one yet.
As far as commercial patterns go, though, I really like this one.
Mhm.
It's, I don't know, I just really, really like this one.
I do too.
And it's titled Folk Art Flowers because it does have that more folksy look to it. It's not quite so highfalutin in its flowers, I guess.
Perhaps we can get Barb to sign in again about those, especially the tulips in the lower left corner, and whatever we want to call the perhaps tulips again in the upper left corner look very Pennsylvania to me.
Well, Saratoga is in southeastern Pennsylvania, actually about 12 minutes from my house. And they are Pennsylvania German tulips. But by the 20s, they had been adopted by other groups.
Yeah.
You know, we're losing the regionalism.
Would you have, because we're losing the regionalism in this period, Barbara, would you have recognized this as a Pennsylvania quilt?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought so.
No.
It's sweetie though. So the other part of the mystery, in that lower right-hand corner, sorry, there it's very obvious that the label in that lower right-hand corner had been appliqued over with another piece of fabric, but short of taking it apart, which we're not going to do, I've shined a bright light behind it, and I still am not able to tell why there was writing under that label that was covered by a second label. Mysteries abound.
Yeah.
Lorraine Dodge is a quilt maker also still with us, who's in her 90s, and several years ago gave us her entire collection of doll beds that her husband had made, and she had made tiny little bits of quilts to go on each doll bed. She also gave us this quilt, which is called Never Again, because she did not enjoy the Baltimore applique style. And this is, I don't think they're original patterns she made, but she would have adapted original patterns because she did have a lot of original quilting. But this is her palette. She really enjoyed dark backgrounds with grayed fabrics over it. The title Never Again refers to her frustration at the detail work involved. The applique flowers are stuffed, folded, beaded, and embroidered. Lorraine used many different stitches and many methods of embellishment, including ruching, which is a technique of gathering strips of fabric to create lifelike three-dimensional blooms. And this one's not very big at all either, Megan. Is it 2.5 feet by 3.5 feet, something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
But again, her workmanship is just wonderful, as is the quilting.
It is. I'm sure everybody out there has a quilt that they would just as soon title Never Again.
I do. It's not finished yet.
But I think that that's really kind of precious that she actually titled it that. Here's the New England album.
It is the New England album. So the Kachiko Quilt Guild, which I've mentioned with Faye before, is a vibrant and amazing quilt guild. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I was a member for years when I lived in the seacoast of New Hampshire, and many of their members are very talented artists. And in 1991, and again in 92 and 93, Ellie Sienkiewicz came and taught at the Kachiko Quilt Guild, and I did take her class, and I made one block. But the Kachiko members took it beyond that, and they became the Good Ladies of Baltimore North, Kachiko chapter, and decided to come up with their own New England album. And each border depicts a different season. You can see the snowflake and the pink blossoms on the upper right-hand corner. There's a cardinal and holly leaves in the top border. Spring and summer are the borders on the right and the left. And then each one of the blocks is a New England motif. And Megan, do you want me to dare try to share my screen? Because I did take some close-ups of some of these blocks.
Sure.
What do you think? Should we try it?
I will stop mine.
Let me see if I can find them. I put them in one place. And never mind, because they didn't come through.
Okay.
Nice try. Anyway, we have the symbol of New Hampshire, which used to be the Old Man in the Mountain. That's in the upper left-hand corner. And again, I've been a little snarky, so I get to be it again. We now call him he fell down quite a few years ago, and we now call him the Old Man in a Pile on the side of the road. But it was a granite foundation on one of the cliffs, and when seen in a certain perspective, as you can see, the upper left-hand corner, and a little more clearly in the upper right-hand corner. And that's part of the reason that New Hampshire is the granite state. Now, where Megan has her cursor, that is a boat called a gundalo. And New Hampshire's rivers are very shallow, and gundalos are flat-bottomed boats with cat rigged so that you can duck under the bridges that cross many of the rivers. Of course, Maine and New Hampshire, Kachiko's made up of mostly members from Maine and New Hampshire. So we have Maine lobsters. We have lots of New Hampshire mountains. The second row on the far right, Maine is the pine tree state. So we have pine cones. Directly below that, we have a pitcher full of lilacs, which is New Hampshire state flower. And I'm pretty sure that's a depiction of Celia Thaxter to the left of that block. And then in the next row down, the second block from the left is the New Hampshire state seal. It's a ship with the sun rising behind it. And the main state seal is the pine tree. And then our Mount Washington Cog Railway goes from the base of the mountain to the 6,000-foot summit. And it's a wonderful way to spend a summer afternoon. So what's the date, Megan? 1995, I think. That didn't come through on my labels, but the Kachiko Quilt Guild has donated 3 just wonderful applique quilts. And that's one that we thought you should see in Iowa because of all the New England symbols on it.
Mm-hmm. And not only, I don't know if you mentioned the corners, the borders, of course, the different, but then they've just got a little bit in each corner that's different too. The snow. Yeah. Very cool.
Ruth McDowell is one of New England's premier art quilters and has written many books about her method for some improvisational piecing, but almost always flower-based. And this one is called crocus or meadow saffron. It's a common name for colchicum, which is a crocus-like bulb, and it throws up leaves in the spring and flowers in the fall. The pattern of the petals is slightly checkered, thus the patchwork on some of the petals. And Ruth writes this: "The inspiration for most of my art quilts is a love of nature. In adapting nature to the quilting medium, I try to distill the essence of the subject, leaving out much more than I put in to uncover the subject's spirit. Each nature quilt becomes an intense exploration of the natural subject matter." Ruth uses home decorating fabrics, the back of fabrics, shirtings, and quilting fabrics in her quilts. In this case, the background is pieced, and the flower petals are pieced and then hand appliqued to the background. This quilt has a sad and then happy ending. Evidently, I will not mention anything beyond that it was a health associate's office in either Cambridge or Boston, probably commissioned or purchased this from Ruth McDowell. And then many years later, a staff member found it on the floor of a closet where it had not been hung for a very long time, and contacted us and asked if we would like it. Ruth would tell you that it's probably quite faded from its original state, but it still makes a beautiful soft statement about Ruth McDowell's work. Thanks, Laura. The office was in Chelmsford. Now this is one that I believe Laura has also found the pattern for. Laura, called Desert Flower, made by Cornelia Klein Barrows, Wilmington, Delaware, hand appliqued and hand pieced. And the label content states, after her husband passed away in 1937, Cornelia Barrows moved from Chicago to Wilmington, Delaware to live with her married daughter. She filled her time with family and quilt making. From the 1930s through 1960s, she made more than 20 quilts. And we have 2 in the collection of the New England Quilt Museum, gifts from her grandson and his wife. The paper pattern for Desert Flower was available for 35 cents in the 1936 catalog from Mary McElwain's quilt shop in Wisconsin. And this particular shade of green and the other fabrics in the quilt are dead giveaways for the period, which is the 1930s and the 1940s. Laura, do you have anything to add?
No, it's just I discovered the pattern when I was in Wisconsin at the Wisconsin Quilt Museum.
Oh, that's the reference then. Good for you. Now this, to me, is a mystery. It was found in a trunk in Maine, and I sent it because of a statement that I had earlier made about New England quilts being not quite as fancy and decorated as other patterns. Like we would expect a high-end or a well-designed quilt to have borders and maybe sashings between this block. But this quilt, along with several others, was stored in a steamer trunk in the attic of a family homestead in Waldboro, Maine. Family history, as passed through 2 generations, attributes this quilt to Mary Sarles of Westchester County, New York. Family history is often wrong, as Sarles died in 1881, and the quilt was more likely made by a different family member after Mary Sarles died. So it did pass down through the Sarles family, and it was either made in Maine or New York. And I'm going to ask Laura again on this one. We just know so little about it, Laura. Do you know anything else?
No, we don't really know much about this one. I believe it's pieced though, rather than appliqued.
Yep. And you know what? I've even forgot, because it's solid fabrics. Did we date it circa 1920, 1930, or is it earlier?
I was going to say 1910, but
Yeah.
I don't remember what's in the record.
No. It's an enigma.
1910 is what you have on the signage.
Yeah, I figured we did. Somewhere in there. First quarter 19th century, 20th century.
Yeah, and the petals are pieced. The brown centers are
Is
appliqued.
appliqued on top.
Yeah, I was just counting them. It's 14 points to each sunflower, I think. And now, actually, Pam, we've done it. We've been through the whole collection.
Oh my goodness. How did we manage that?
Kind of amazing.
Oh, Janet Bergeron has typed in the chat that the Hawaiian quilt is probably plumeria. Thank you. We'll do a little research on plumeria.
As it looks like a frangipani plumeria. That's a fun word to say.
Say that fast after 3 glasses of wine.
So this would be a great time if anybody has questions that they want to ask about a particular quilt that we've seen either today or in our presentation 2 weeks ago, which was the earlier quilts, the whole cloth quilts, the red and green quilts from the early 20th century. You can either put that in the chat or you can do the raise hand feature on the Zoom meeting, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and turn your video on and let us know your question. Shirley, I see that you've unmuted yourself. If you've got a question, go ahead.
I was going to ask about the stamped quilt. What kind of paint did they use?
I would use stenciled instead of stamped, Shirley. Laura,
Okay.
do you know whether Frances was using oils or acrylics?
I don't. But I did want to add that one was based on an antique quilt. It's not an exact replica, but it's recognizable, and I did have a picture of the actual antique.
She did. I'm trying to remember, Laura, the Vermont Quilt Festival exhibit where there are 10 or 15 stenciled quilts. She did a tremendous number of them. Oh, yes, you're right. Now that I'm looking at that center again, the basket is very similar to that antique quilt, but she changed a couple of features. Did she scale it down? Is that what she did? Or scale it up?
There were more baskets down the center. It was more rectangular, where this is square.
Yeah.
So she used all the same motifs. She just rearranged them a bit.
Yep. Shirley, I was taught by a person who did a lot of early American decorative painting to stencil on fabric in 1978 or 79. And she had us using oils. And we did not water them down, but we used a very dry brush to pounce the paint into the edges of the stencil for the shading. And I would extrapolate that on Frances. If she was taught and did a lot of early American decoration, my educated guess would be that she used oils.
Okay. I did a little bit of stenciling, but we used acrylic, so I
Yep.
didn't know.
And
But I'm clear out on the West Coast, so things change out here.
and there were also, I think I still have one. We had something called oil crayons that you actually mushed into a palette and then put your dry brush into that to stamp or pounce the color onto your fabric.
Well, the colors sure look beautiful on there, preserved nicely.
They're gorgeous. They're gorgeous.
They have this nice shading, this in color. It's just, they're really very beautiful. Almost like, I don't know, today we would say an umbra.
Ombre?
Ombre or umbra?
Yep. My grandmother would call that shading.
So we've got a couple things about Hawaiian quilts, and Lois has one that her mother started and she finished, and she's wondering if anybody knows the name of it, and she's got a picture. Hang on, Lois, I'm going to spotlight your photo. Okay.
Oh.
Lois's Hawaiian quilt, another blue and white. Does anybody who's familiar with Hawaiian quilts know a pattern for this? Not hearing anything, Lois.
I'm going to take. Leave it there. I'm going to take a screenshot of it.
Uh-oh. Okay.
Just put it back up. All right. I've taken a screenshot of it, and I'll see if it's in any of the books that I've got sitting on my bedside table.
Thank you.
And then Lindsay is commenting on, you mentioned the legend of the Hawaiian quilts, and she had heard something about Germans bringing the art of cutting Scherenschnitte to the islands, and that inspired the quilts. Have you heard anything about that, Pam?
I have not, and I would have to look it up to make sure that did not happen, but people all the time are mixing up Scherenschnitte with Hawaiian quilting. The first people to teach the Hawaiians quilting at all were early New England settlers from Connecticut and I believe Ohio. Sue Reich knows a lot more about that early missionary missions than I do. But all the time, people are looking at the Pennsylvania German cut work applique or paper cut applique and relating it to Hawaiian quilting. And to my knowledge, there is no evidence of that. Again, Barbara Garrett.
They're similar. The Sharon Snitte of the Pennsylvania Germans came first. Um, I have heard the rumor that the Pennsylvania Germans took Sharon Snitte to Hawaii, but I have not seen written evidence.
So I reviewed 3 books on Hawaiian quilting by 3 different authors for this exhibit, as well as for, we hung a Hawaiian royal flag in one of our exhibits recently, and none of those authors mention any German connection at all. So maybe somebody needs to dig deeper.
Yeah, I have not seen it. I've heard it, but I have not seen evidence.
Exactly.
Well, it may be that that's a great example of things that folklore, that gets passed off kind of as fact. And if something makes sense, it's easy for that to happen, to make that connection and for that to be propagated. Pam, I know you and I have talked about the Underground Railroad, the quilts of the Underground Railroad, and how that has become propagated as factual when there is very little to none, no evidence to support that as a historical fact. But it's a nice idea and it's a pleasant thought. And so it does become propagated.
And it's a lovely story, and that's, people love good stories. I will review some of those books again. So the last question Michael's asking, it seems like you know the name of each of the quilter, but when you date a quilt, is it tricky as the fabric is much older than when the actual quilt was made? So you're addressing a couple of things here. We can date a quilt by the fabric in it. And there's a chance that some people had really deep scrap bags. But if they had really deep scrap bags and they were making a quilt with lots of fabrics in it, they also would have used fabrics from their own lifetime. And therefore we date the quilt to the latest fabrics in it. I personally, when volunteering with the New Hampshire Quilt Documentation Project, saw a quilt that had 100 years of fabric in it, from the 1830s and 40s into the 1930s and 40s. It depends. It also, the style rules dating it, but generally it's the fabric. And that's why it's so hard to date quilts that don't have printed cottons or printed textiles in them. Nancy's asking again about potholder quilts. So Nancy, a potholder quilt is the wrong name for quilts that were made in the 19th century up through today. And they are distinguished by the way they are made. If you took a potholder quilt apart, you would have a pile of finished blocks. You make a block, you layer it and quilt it, and you finish the edge using many different kinds of finishes, from bringing the backing to the front, to binding it, to finishing at knife edge. And I bought one by accident at an auction and didn't know what I'd bought until I brought it home and turned it over and said, what the heck is this? Because it was a gorgeous silk quilt, but every block was individually bound, and then they were all stitched together. And I took it to a couple of different experts. And by the time I'd brought the third one that I've collected to Gerald Roy, he told me to go away, leave him alone, and become the expert on these quilts. And to my surprise, the earliest one that we've discovered so far is dated 1837. So again, with my snarky hat on, I love to say that no, Georgia Bonesteel did not invent quilt as you go. It was more than 130 years before she did her brilliant work on lap quilting and got us all doing it. It is a form of quilt as you go. The umbrella term is quilt as you go. You can make a quilt and finish it in sections without individually binding each of those sections, but that's what delineates a potholder quilt. Every block is individually finished. And that's why we call them potholder quilts, because you don't have to explain to somebody what a potholder is, generally, unless there's somebody who's never seen a kitchen.
And so if you took it apart, you would have a whole stack of potholders.
Exactly.
How interesting. I mean, I've said quite often I'm fairly new to the quilt world and I don't have any formal training But in the 5 years that I've been at this museum, I've encountered a lot of quilts, but I've never encountered a potholder quilt. And so this
Well, would you like another exhibit?
I will put it on our list. That would be fun. And last week, um, had one hanging behind you. So if
Mhm.
you didn't get to see one in person, or if you would like to see one in person, check out our video. Actually, it's from 2 weeks ago, and there was one hanging on the wall behind Pam, and she actually kind of pulled it up and showed it to us a little bit.
If I can find the right part on my computer again, I was just reviewing some of my images. Well, here's a spectacular one that was made in 1851 in Maine. Let me figure out if I can make it small so I can share my screen. Hello.
You should be able to now. I made you a co-host.
Are you seeing that?
Mm-hmm.
So this is one from Cumberland County, Maine, and there was a whole mess of them made in the 1850s in this county in Maine. And these blocks are all individually finished. They're all made by different people and all signed by different people. But what I want to see if I can find quickly, oh, I just made a file of them. Darn it. I hate to have people hang out while I look for stuff.
So on this one, somebody's had to make their blocks in triangles and finish them that way.
So sometimes they did, but they also learned to, here's another one. This is a crazy potholder. I'm not going to find it quickly enough. Sorry, guys. No, in the wrong place. Let's forget it. I'll stop sharing. Instead of, so a typical Maine quilt made potholder style in this period, they would make all the blocks and some of them actually got whacked in half. And they would put half the block on this side and half the block on this side. And then on several of these quilts, instead of binding that little triangle, they'd fit it in and then run new binding all the way around the outside of the quilt.
Very, very cool. If you've got, I'm not seeing anything else coming into the chat window, but if you do have one more quick question for Pam, go ahead and throw that into the chat window and we'll see if we can answer that. But while we're doing that, I'm just going to give a little preview. Next week, Barb Garrett, who has actually piped in several times about our Pennsylvania connections, Barb Garrett is going to be our guest. And this is actually one that we're going to pre-record and air next Tuesday because we're also going to be joined by a local family. And the reason that Barb is joining us is because a quilt was donated to us. And I said we don't collect quilts. We have a very small collection of educational quilts for this purpose. A quilt was donated to us. I put a picture of it on Facebook and it exploded with likes and shares. It's a bullseye quilt. It's really, really well made, and I wish I could quickly get to a picture of it, but you'll just have to come back next week. And Barb quickly commented that this quilt has Pennsylvania connections, which I had no idea. So then I reached out to the family who's in Iowa, and they said, oh yes, our family is originally from Pennsylvania. So our topic next week is these regional styles, specifically with Pennsylvania, and kind of the idea of quilts that travel and styles that travel, etc. So I'm also issuing an invitation because, like I said, we're going to pre-record part of this program. If anybody out there has a quilt that they know has traveled or the family has traveled, we would love to hear about your quilt that has traveled from one part of the country to another. So that's next week. Another thing that we have coming up semi-soon is the Madison County airing of the quilts. And so I will be talking about this at any chance that I'm given for the next 10 weeks. And that is Saturday, June 5th here in Winterset and Madison County. And that is our community-wide quilt festival. Think Sisters Oregon on a slightly smaller scale. But we hang quilts in our covered bridges, our 1840s limestone courthouse, all over our community, businesses, historic homes, etc. And we would love to have lots and lots of you join us for that day. It is a fundraising event for the Quilt Museum, and so there is a ticket associated with that, but it's really beyond that, a celebration of quilting in Iowa. And so we do hope that you'll come, and there will be an auction associated with that as well. So we will be putting up our auction in an online format soon. If you are not on our email list through the Quilt Museum, this is a great time to get on that so that you can find out all of the information as it is released about the airing of the quilts. And you can do that at our website, which is iowaquiltmuseum.org. And I'll type that into the chat window real quick. iowaquiltmuseum.org. Oh, I got it without having to backspace. First try. All right, so I haven't seen anything else come into the chat window, except for a couple of private messages of suggestions for future exhibits, which we love. Our list of future exhibits is much, much longer than we have time and breadth to exhibit. We do 4 exhibits a year, and actually next year I think we will do 5, but the list of potential exhibit ideas is endless. So Pam, thanks so much for joining us today. It's so good to meet you and to hear about all of these quilts from New England. We so have enjoyed this exhibit. It will be up through the airing of the quilts. So if you're coming to Winterset for that event, it will still be here, actually for one more day beyond that, June 6th. Tell me how glutton for punishment I am that we're going to do a major event on Saturday and change out the exhibit 2 days later. But it is what it is, and we love it all.
You must be my sister.
Thank you to all of our audience or our guests for joining us today. We appreciate having you online. We'll be back next Tuesday with Barb and the Pennsylvania Bullseye Quilt. And then we'll have one more program the last week of April. So a lovely afternoon to you all. Thanks again
Thank you all.
and we'll see you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you.